Andre, Denise, all yours.
Awesome, thank you. Well, glad to be here, and hello everybody from sunny Miami. I always have to say that. Glad to be with you, and thank you, Denise, for joining us. I'll just start sharing my screen.
Wait a minute, I get to introduce myself. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. My name's Denise Ruffner. I'm with Cambridge Quantum Computing, Chief Business Officer, and I'm coming to you from Southern California. I live in the low rent area of Pasadena called Altadena, and actually it's a beautiful, hot, sunny summer day. So I hope the weather is good by you. It's a perfect Southern California day. So Andre, you go now.
Good, and Denise and I, we have a couple joint side projects. One of them is a video podcast with Tommaso De Marie from Anthropica Labs called Weekly Quantum World Detangled. So all the slides that I'll present and then some of the data we actually put up here, quantumworlddetangled.com QIS ecosystem, so you can access that. Thank you, Quantum Appaloosa, for having us.
Oh.
And thank you, Cambridge Quantum Computing, for supporting this. We'll be pretty quick on the slides. Stop me with questions anytime. The meat of the presentation will be some data that I want to share and your questions. But to do a quick introduction, and this is not letting me go full screen. Well, too bad. My mission kind of in quantum technologies, and I've been working on it for over 3 years now, is to bring data to decision making, because I believe, as Edward Demings of manufacturing fame said, without data you're just another person with an opinion. So for over 3 years I've been collecting data on the ecosystem, the vendors, the startups, investors, all that good stuff. We'll see a bunch of it today. And I help executives, startups, and investors in their decision making. We'll jump over most of these slides, just a little bit on my background and why I do this. Actually, I studied economics at the University of Chicago, and one of my professors was Dick Taylor, who won the Economic Nobel Prize for Behavioral Economics. And one thing he taught us was the cognitive bias codex, which is this idea that we all are subject to cognitive biases, and actually the more educated and the smarter we are, the more likely we are to be subject to these cognitive biases. Things like availability heuristics, where our brain tends to remember the latest data point that we saw within a specific context and refer back to that. Overconfidence bias, and all these things that really make us individually believe that, yes, data is awesome. Everybody should be making data-driven decisions. But me, myself, it's different. I don't really need it. I'm so smart, so experienced. I'll just make a quick decision. And there's a bunch of research, if anybody is interested in that, that looks at how entrepreneurs and investors specifically misjudge things such as market size, company valuations, go-to-market, all these kind of things, because they tend to believe gut an opinion rather than look intelligence. Before, as an entrepreneur with a startup that I did together with IBM and a management consultant for a dozen years, is to bring some frameworks and data to the ecosystem and decision making. We use some reports, company analysis, ecosystem analysis, like a Gartner or an investment bank would do, to help facilitate that. And that is something that I talk a lot about with investors, and we're going to look at some investor data as well. But here's just an example of how we use this data in a very specific use case, namely investors trying to understand the quantum tech market, where to source deals and how to decide who to invest in. And investors, what you find, and we have the data on that, are very network-driven and very opinion-driven. But with data, looking at it, you can actually start to segment the market very nicely by QIS application, software, hardware, sensing, communications, QKD, and then different levels, which can be easily mapped to different stages of an investor fund, be it a seed fund, early stage, venture capital, or even later D and C rounds and private equity and so forth. So that's one of the use cases that we use a lot. Just one last word is, it's not the data in itself that interests us, but what the data tells us. Once we have that data and we track how the data changes over time and compares across, quantum applications, quantum regions, companies, and so forth, you start to see anomalies, extremes, changes over time, gaps, and that is where the real intelligence kind of comes from. One more slide. The way we collect the data is, unlike other folks in the industry, not based on our networks or what we believe we know, but rather using technology, systematically parsing a proprietary list of web sources, as well as Google News, of course, all social media channels, but also a large network of private contacts. We put all of that into a database, meta tag the data, and then visualize it in some fun tools that we're going to show you. So let's fast forward. Let's check it out exactly. Here I use a tool called Sisense, which is a data visualization tool. First thing I wanted to do is to give you a sense, we're in the data tab here, of what the raw data looks like, so you get a better understanding of that. These are two lists that I uploaded. I should have named them better, master list and master list 1. But if we pop one open, you can see that in all these master lists, what we're really interested in is entity. Entity will be startups, vendors, universities, labs, and so forth. And then we just have a few dozen meta tags that enrich this entity master list. So this is all the kind of data that we extract, track, and update on a weekly basis. So our data, and I have around 30,000 data points in our database, is not only more exhaustive and bigger than what you might find in other sources, but it is also a lot richer and deeper because we really track kind of all these different attributes to the data. And that's what allows us to really do some analysis. Just checking the chat. Could you make the slides larger? Yeah, sorry about that. You can see them on the website. If I go back to the slides, I'll make them larger, but hopefully you can see the data fine, which is the much more interesting part of this presentation. So looking at this entity data list, we're now in the analytics tab. What is really important to me is that we don't provide just lists and static visualizations of the data, but really try to make the data interactive and meaningful, which is why we use tools like Sisense or Tableau to do that. Let me just give you a quick idea of how this functions for those who haven't seen it. Here you create a widget. A widget is part of a dashboard. This widget, you start by selecting a field. In this data set entities, I would start by selecting entity, and then decide if I want this entity as an attribute, as a filter, or as a measure. So do I want to count it? Do I want to use it as a dimension, as a descriptor, or whatever else it might be? And here, by the way, you see if I go into entities, I have a total of 1,130 total entities that I'm tracking. So what are these entities? Let's add entity type, which is the descriptor of what the entity is, to it. And now you see entity types, as I mentioned earlier, startup, research institute, vendor, and so forth. Now all that I have to do is do a count on my entities, and this is going to give me a nice breakdown of how many entities we have per category. So that's what I did in this entity dashboard here. Out of these 1,130 entities in quantum technologies, and these are only entities that we were able to verify. We do not include data that is kind of hearsay or rumored, only things that are publicly verifiable or privately verifiable. 43% of these entities are, 43% of these entities are actually startups. A lot of them are university labs and research labs. And then we have all this other section of vendors, medias, and so forth that we can break down. But here the main takeaway basically is that the startup ecosystem, and this is over 400 startups by now, is very, very large. And what we're seeing in this data is that more and more startups are starting to take market share in mind share, in potential projects and partnerships from the large vendors. 5 years ago, there was only IBM, right? 2 years ago, there were many others, but IBM and Denise had a hand in that. So I'll pause to get your feedback. Build an amazing ecosystem and still dominating the market. That has changed today. Not only are there other large vendors out there, but all of these startups, are really starting to take a lot of market share. Here we have a world map, and after that, I'll pause to take questions. That gives a little bit of a geographical breakdown. No surprise, we all know that the US is market leading here. Canada very strong. What we are seeing is that the geographical distribution of these entities, and we can break that down by startups, vendors, research labs, is really starting to spread out very quickly. India is fairly new on my map. There's more and more in Africa, Latin America, obviously Europe, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later on, is very, very strong.
Andre,
yes, go.
Can you go up a little bit? We have a question from, what is that 32% in the first circle?
That is a breakdown of other categories, consultants, quantum media companies, of which there is almost a dozen at this point. There are at least 3 venture capital funds that are dedicated to quantum technology. So this is just a category that collects all of these miscellaneous, and we can break that down further.
Thank you.
So, and the inside here is that there is really a large ecosystem. It is not just folks building hardware and folks writing software. There is a lot of other things around it, which is good and bad at the same time. There are people like me, hopefully you'll think that's good, who do data, a little bit of consulting, a little bit of publishing. But there's a lot of media publications, funding capital, we'll look at that in a second, and so forth, around really building a very, very large ecosystem. We have a few more questions. So Denise, I don't know if you have any comments from your days at IBM or today at Cambridge, which is probably the largest startup, and we'll look at some of the questions in the chat as well.
Okay, so one is, I did want to come back to, you made a comment, and it's actually something I've been observing, is that there's a migration of customers. So when quantum computing started, at IBM, we got a lot of big companies that started up their own quantum staff and had, big initiatives, and those could be banks or many other institutions. And then what I started to see is a little bit of a migration where these corporates would then reach out to a startup, and rather than assemble a large staff, would come to a startup and ask the startup to help them develop a program or develop algorithms. So that's something that I noticed from IBM, and I see at Cambridge Quantum Computing, where we have a lot of Fortune 500 customers coming to us. And I just wanted to ask you, Andre, if you've seen the same thing in your data or you have a point of view there.
Yes, and we're jumping a little bit ahead. I'll answer that in a minute, but absolutely. Let me quickly answer two questions from the chat. One very interesting, why I distinguish software and algorithms. That's really just something I saw in the data, and I'm not sure if I'm right or wrong, but I came across a lot of startups that really say we just think about algorithms, especially in chemistry. Also in machine learning, but that have not so far really attempted to write software. They would actually work with a CQC and Denise or somebody else to get that software. But they are really still focused at a very basic scientific level to just write and understand algorithms. Whereas there are some companies out there that are very clearly software, right? Cambridge Quantum Computing does those, for instance, but Cambridge Quantum Computing very specifically does software as well, and just announced your new compiler, I believe, as well, right?
Correct. Thank you.
Of course, always the plug. How is IBM counted? IBM is counted as a single entity. So here we look at thank you for your Etsy link, Denise. We'll go shopping.
I know. I said, oops, that's wrong. That's an old link. Sorry.
So IBM is counted as a single entity in an entity type vendor. Those are the large vendors, Google, Alibaba, and so forth. The research labs that Google might work with are counted as research institute entities. I have other data sets where we look at number of professors, number of circuits, number of machines that might be able to break this down differently. You are able to get this presentation and a couple of data sets here on this website, quantumworlddetangled.com, QIS ecosystem. The data that I'm showing here is proprietary. You can buy it from me. If you have a specific question about something, just message me, which you can do from this website, and I'd be happy to answer it. Let's look at the next data set. And this data set I've never shown in public, so I'm giving you an exclusive worldwide premiere, and I'm showing you only a little glimpse of it, but this hopefully also answers your question, Denise. I have a data set around use cases, and what we see here is that I'm currently able to count 78 distinct unique use cases. So these are customers, you know, we all know the big famous ones, Volkswagen, BMW, or Airbus, and so forth, working on mostly quantum computing projects, but also communication, sensing, QKD. And the number of unique use cases that we see is 78. My total data set around use cases is somewhere around 300. The point here is that there is less than a dozen of use cases that are repeated very, very frequently. Around traveling salesman problem, around battery optimization in automotive, obviously the financial use cases that we know. And I have a little bit of a breakdown down here by industry. Vertical where these use cases are being displayed, and 49% is a miscellaneous category that we are still classifying or struggle to classify. But you know, the point here is that the big categories, transportation, investment banking, insurance banking, automotive, no surprises here, but good validation, good data. What we see in this data is if I were to pull up a comparison with entities to these use cases, folks don't just work with IBM or Accenture or Microsoft anymore. They are working with a number of increasing partners, startups, larger ecosystems that are forming. And that is a big trend in the data that we're seeing lately. If you look a year or 2 years back, these folks around their use cases had 1 or 2 partners. Today, they have a handful of partners. and that is a big trend. Does that answer your question, Denise?
That does. That does. That's great data.
We have one more question in the chat.
So
78 unique POCs or unique use cases. So these are, and there's always, even in data, a little bit of judgment in it. Let me actually show you what a use case would look like. Maybe that's the best way to answer it. So these are what we believe are unique use cases, not just a proof of technology or concept. Some of them are very high level, some of them are very specific. Efficient frontier of portfolio maximization, those kind of things. So we track those use cases, but we track them based on the projects that we're able to see in the market. Does that answer your question around use cases? Good, nothing else in the chat. Then we'll move on to what is always my favorite data, which is the investor data. And I just came out with a report on investments in quantum technologies for the first 2 quarters of this year. And that was a record-breaking year in the first 6 months, and a number of interesting insights here. The first, apologies that this is not in the right order, the total amount of investments that we were able to verify is 386 million USD in the first 6 months of 2020. That is a huge sum compared to what we've seen in previous years. It is difficult to get absolute numbers. A lot of people put the total, and this is private capital, not government subsidies, programs, or grants, but private capital. Some people put the total investments of quantum techs to date somewhere around $1 billion to $1.5 billion. I think it might be a little bit higher. So close to 400 million in the first 6 months of this year is huge. That is by a total of 67 investors, which is extremely large. 28 of those investors are from Europe, which gets back to this point in entities. You see an increasing amount of capital not only flowing into European startups, obviously the US and the PsiQuantum is skewing this data here, and Canada is still huge, but Europe is really attracting a lot of investments, but Europe is also a big source of capital. The US only was a source of $85 million in these first 6 months. If you look at some of the European money out of France, Germany, Finland, the UK was huge. That was a PsiQuantum investor, but also India being put on the map. We're seeing a diversification of investor sources here that really leads us to believe that the whole quantum tech ecosystem is accelerating tremendously. Let's look at these 2 initial charts. On the right, quantum tech investments in 2020 so far. We have a huge spike. This is PsiQuantum that raised 215 million. On the left side, we took PsiQuantum out to unscrew this a little bit. What is interesting is that Q1 and Q2 attracted roughly equal amounts without PsiQuantum. Somewhere around 90 million for Q1 and 80 million for Q2. There is no quantum winter, at least not when you believe the money. And a business guy like me always believes the money. And that is something I was, at least a little surprising to see. So, Q1 was very strong, no slowdown in the crisis. The crisis has only accelerated this. Quantum is coming very fast. Denise, you had a question?
Yeah, so John Zur has a question on why no private investment in Asia. And John, I would qualify that and say, I do know of private investors in Asia. I don't know of venture investing from Asian firms in the first half. So maybe that's something you can answer, Andre.
Yeah, so there absolutely are Asian investors. I know a company that has attracted Asian capital. It is not publicly verifiable, which is why Russia is blank, China is blank, and some of Asia is blank as well. I try not to engage. I prefer to miss a data point or not include a data point rather than to include a data point on something that I just heard somewhere. It has to be verifiable. And that means there needs to be a public source, or there needs to be a statement by a company executive that specifically confirms that investment. I know that there have been investments out of Asia and into Asia, some very interesting ones. I would put them somewhere between 20 to 30 million, a lot of it into software, but it's just hard to get the hard verifiable data, which is why there's still a blank spot. We update this data literally every day. Farai, Mazandu, and my team, and we're expanding that team. They spend all day and many times all night working on this. So, the more you check back, hopefully the better we'll be able to answer those kind of questions. But that's the main reason.
Andre, one question. I know Horizon Quantum just closed, I think 2.4 million US, which is with some great investors, and one of the investors was out of India.
Yep.
Are there other investors in India? Now, is that 2.4 all Horizon, or is that other investments?
There were investors out of India. There were investors out of Singapore. We've also seen investors out of Japan. Again, it's really difficult to confirm that. Horizon was the big bulk. Our friend Tommaso that I mentioned earlier at Anthropica Labs in Singapore had a fundraise that we probably should include here. Tommaso, if you're listening, send me an email with the exact amounts, and we'll put that in there. So both Horizon and Anthropica Labs have in Singapore have raised funds. Those funds came out of Singapore, out of India, and out of Japan.
Good question, and this is a topic that always comes up, is investment timelines. So there's a lot of people that say that it's hard to get VCs to invest in quantum computing because the time to capitalize and get return on the investment may or may not be slow or slower than VCs want. And so could you talk about that a little bit?
That is a big problem. And in investing, there are two types of capital. There's the type of capital that you call friends, families, and fools, the 3 Fs. And that's, let's call it very friendly and trusted capital that just says, hey, Denise, I trust you. I'm going to give you some money. Obviously, that's not going to be millions and millions unless you have that kind of family and friends, which is great. If you look at the more professional investors, and this is what the chart down here shows, seed rounds, B rounds, bridge A and D rounds, obviously the amounts get larger the later stage the investment round is, but what you really see here is that even bridge rounds and seed rounds, A rounds, which are the early investment rounds, very, very significant. There's a large distribution of $2-3 million deals being made in the A round stage, of seed stage deals, of bridge deals, so kind of additional capital inflows in between investment rounds to keep the company afloat. And this is more professional capital, professional angel syndicates, family offices, venture capitalists, and they absolutely struggle with the timelines. That is probably the #1 question. I myself am currently involved in leading an investment round of 70 million euros. If you look at this chart, 88% of all investments in the first 6 months has flown into quantum computing hardware, quantum computers or full stack quantum computing efforts, which is tremendous. This means that investors believe quantum is coming. It is coming faster and faster. 6 months ago, most people that I asked would say, it's 10 to 15 years out. Now the bulk of my conversations, people say 5 to 10 years, if not less than 5 years. And investors are buying into that narrative, which is why you see that money flowing in there. So it's still very difficult. Raising money is a continuous effort. It's not something that you just turn on and off. But when you do that, and when you have that narrative, then you're absolutely able to raise that money.
So 2 important points of discussion, I think, is really, one is how far away is quantum computing overall? So I think ever since I've been in it, everybody said it's 5 to 10 years away, and that was even 5 years ago. So I think the timeline is shortening, especially when we see developments like the Honeywell device. And I think there's going to be a lot of innovation from other areas as well. Andre, you just said 5 years. What do you think? Are you clear on 5 years? Do you think it's sooner? Any commentary?
If I had to put my money on it, right? I mean, we see some of the large vendors that are just entering the scene being very aggressive and talking about 3 years, if not less. And those vendors make a very credible case for that. We see some of these startups like IQM in Finland and Germany who have what they call a co-design strategy, where they actually will work with a BMW, an Airbus, Allianz, whatever it might be, to co-design not just the hardware stack, but also the software stack. And they believe that through that approach, they can dramatically reduce the time to practical quantum advantage. Obviously, we're not talking about a supreme universal quantum computer, but actually solving some of these use cases that we talked about earlier in a practical manner that classically would not make sense, and with a financial bottom line. So, there are folks out in that, call it NISQ era, that believe it's less than 5 years, and they make a very, very credible case. The more you see somebody like a Honeywell that is really, an industrial conglomerate, it's the opposite of Google. It's not a sexy West Coast tech giant. It's a very deliberate, careful, conservative conglomerate. When they get into Honeywell, that's not to play games or get on the cover of Forbes or TechCrunch. That is because they believe they can commercialize a technology in the very near term. And when you start to see those kind of things, then I think you should pay attention.
Okay. And John asked a question that, quantum computing is coming, that I wanted to clarify that I was referring to the current NISQ computers, not fault tolerant. I think fault tolerant is still further out. But I think that NISQ computers that can deliver quantum advantage is when I talk about a timeline for quantum computing, that's what I'm talking about. So I don't know, Andre, if you would add to that, but that's where I think it's going very quickly, actually.
The capital, the private capital believes so, government capital believes so as well. I'm sure you've all seen that my home country of Germany just committed 2 billion euros to quantum computing specifically. They are building 2 quantum computers now, most likely in Munich and Leipzig. That comes on top of over $1 billion at the European level announced within the last 4 weeks. India is going into it in a big way, and that follows, the rumored 10 billion out of China, a couple billion in the US, same in Canada and the rest of Europe. And this ecosystem, there was a question earlier what the other 32% are. This chart is a little older. This data is probably 5 to 6 weeks old, but you get a little bit more of a breakdown here. Sorry that I don't show all the detail, but I'm very protective of my data. So here you see a little bit more of the breakdown of what kind of, what I called entities earlier, what kind of companies are out there. Very interesting that there's actually more software companies than hardware companies. And the number of hardware companies, folks building actual quantum computing hardware is very significant. There's a lot of people out there. We saw Alice and Bob making an announcement out of France a few weeks ago. Every couple of weeks there seems to be a new, very, very credible player out there. And let's not forget PsiQuantum, 200 million, and that is very, very smart, highly educated capital. PsiQuantum must have made an amazing business case and technology case to their investors to convince them to invest 200 million and more. I don't know any details about it, unfortunately. But yeah, what the data shows is that we're growing at a neck-breaking speed in number of companies, the number of categories, the number of use cases, the number of capital, and it has not slowed down over the last 3 months and the beginning of this year. Quite the opposite.
So Andre, let's talk about use cases for a minute. Since I said quantum advantage is coming sooner than later, I'd love to hear yours and even the audience's point of view on what use cases you think will be the most promising in the short term.
Let's see what the audience has to say. Anyone has any guesses or opinions?
So it's a great question, and I don't know if any of you are working in certain areas where you see something coming, but I'd love to hear what you guys are thinking, and then we'll tell what we're thinking.
My money's on finance.
Okay.
What corner of finance?
Well, probably the portfolio optimization piece. It's a tangible problem that could probably benefit, I think, from entanglement and superposition, that sort of thing. There's a lot of people working on it, and if somebody could figure it out, I could see a lot of people rallying around that. You make a lot of money that way.
Yeah, I think we have more money on the table here. Molecular engineering for pharmaceutical applications. I like that one. And Jefim, you're interested in learning what the really promising and realizable use cases are, I assume, that make financially sense. And I think that's the key point here. I speak to clients every day, and Denise does so even more, right? Both small companies as well as some of the largest Fortune 50. There used to be a set of use cases, automotive, optimizing your batteries for electrical cars, optimizing the routing of cars, or FedEx, airplanes. There used to be a lot of, what you suggested, Terrell, financial services, portfolio theory, risk management, trading, and so forth. There used to be a lot of material science. Can we come up with new coatings, new materials to do this or that? What a lot of companies seem to find is that the effort it takes to realize that is a no financial relationship to the quantum resources it takes. Doing that on a NISC area cloud device would be extremely difficult. Buying an on-premise quantum computer is very expensive and maybe not the smartest decision, unless it's Christmas, that you can make. So doing that is very, very difficult. I think what companies are looking at, and somebody here is saying quantum encryption, that is absolutely right. It is some of these other quantum information science applications around sensing, which is very important when it comes to things like mining, assessing deposits in the earth or in the ocean, which has tremendous applications in mining, in oil, in energy, and so forth. Quantum communications is something that we're seeing grow very fast. It is technically a little less ambitious and has a use case that is commercially more viable. On the quantum computing side, I think a lot of these companies, to close the circle, are going back to, okay, what else can we do? Quantum chemistry always comes out at the very top. And the reason it comes out at the very top is because it's mathematically actually very simple. You have a high number of variables, but you don't have a lot of data behind that you need to deal with. So that is a problem that a quantum computer can most likely solve much easier and much sooner than something that has a lot of data behind it, like a financial application. I think that's where a lot of heads are moving. Denise, anything you'd add or?
So I think George made a really good point about encryption. I think we will see some quantum encryption solutions that that are very innovative. I think we're going to see that in the next 6 months. There's a lot of great quantum encryption work being done, and certainly the idea of having quantum generated keys to start migrating people's security from today's standards towards a new quantum standard, I think is going to be happening over the next 6 months. So I think that's big. I think on chemistry, there are many molecules, large and small, and I think we will see some quantum advantage with small molecules, and a lot of work on bonds and bond lengths and stuff that we can't do, we can only estimate now. So I see, but I also do see a lot of finance work in Monte Carlo and in other areas that I think is really interesting. John is just mentioning GPS-free navigation and timing. That's amazing, kind of going geospatial on us. So that's a great suggestion, John. I think there's a lot of intrusion detection. Another good one, Sanjay. I think there's a lot of stuff that I've seen that's still like right on the edge of commercialization, where you look at intrusion detection, where you look at quantum generated keys, where you look at chemistry. And I think we're going to start seeing some really nice data and science over the next 6 months.
And Sanjay says massive combinatoric problems. That's absolutely right. I think in real time is challenging. I don't know when the last time was that you sat in an IBM queue. It's not real time. Honeywell is a great machine, but it needs a lot of TLC and time. So unless you want to buy a computer and put it into your basement, real-time solutions are a little farther out.
So Andre, one of the things that I've noticed is kind of, if I look at 2018, the first half of 2018 and 2019 had a proliferation of software startups. And now I'm seeing more of a, I think, now this is just me without your data, I'm seeing more hardware startups growing. Do you have something to say about the ratio of startups being developed, like let's say from 2018 through now?
Yeah, that's a good question. Over the last 3 months, there has been a much stronger growth in new hardware startups than there has been growth in software startups. I can't give you the exact numbers right now. I would put the new software startups that came onto the scene, into the palm of one hand, and maybe I don't even need all my fingers. And there have been more and more companies coming out of labs or stealth mode, and really across modalities too. Obviously superconducting, but there have been new ion trap startups, there have been new photonic startups that have been coming out of either stealth mode or university laboratories. And I think that is something that is growing a lot faster, which means that these devices are getting easier to build, right? We're spreading a lot of our knowledge, and obviously it's still tremendously hard and expensive, but it's within reach for more and more folks. We also see, different modalities, with the exception of topological quantum computing, really gaining traction in terms of startups, but also capital supporting them. So folks are feeling confident that specific modalities will be able to deliver these kind of results. And we see that the capital, the investors is buying these stories. And when private investors buy this kind of story, hey, we university lab, our spin out can build a qubit and read it out. That means they have the track record to prove it. So absolutely, it's growing fast, which means that we are at this inflection point. If you think back to other technologies, artificial intelligence or digital or whatever else it might be, where it is not something that needs to happen upstate at IBM or in Mountain View. It is something that is really growing very fast.
It's interesting to me how many new hardware startups there are. And when I looked at, I wrote down, you said 74 hardware companies as of your last count. And that's a lot of hardware.
Yep.
So I think that's an amazing area for innovation. But I think there also will be consolidation. And I don't know if you have a point of view on that, or it's too early to tell.
It's just the more, and do take my data with a grain of salt. At the end of the day, data is an opinion as well. But, sometimes I sit down with my team and say, let's look at this country a little bit more. Because, I feel there might be a country in Asia or in Europe or in South America that we haven't really looked at well. And you always find a few teams that are building hardware, that are writing software, that are working with companies. And you saw that world map earlier, and that's really spreading. We looked at Japan, which isn't reflected in the data yet. Japan itself has 2 to 3 dozen different companies in quantum software and hardware. Very few of us know about them, right? Yeah, it's quite impressive.
Andre, for the people on the call, I think everybody seems to be pretty knowledgeable about quantum, but I was wondering if you would review some resources that they can learn more or stay connected. Where do you go to get your information? If you could just share a little bit on how people can stay connected with this community. And I'll give a plug for the Quantum Appalooza website, which I think is fabulous, from Terrell. But Andre, what do you recommend to the audience to use to learn more about quantum?
Yep, and not to leave Sanjay's question unanswered about qubits, but I'm not a quantum physicist, unfortunately. I did a little bit of MIT, but not enough to give you the in and outs of qubit modalities. But we're not looking at just photon traps. There indeed are many other technologies, and I'm happy to talk about that offline. Me, by my nature, I obviously track a lot of different sources, but we also make a lot of different sources public. For one, Quantum Palooza, and we put them up here, right? Our friend Terrell does an amazing job at not only collecting events and jobs within quantum technologies, but also spreading that publicly. So Quantum Appaloosa, not Quantum Palooza, but Quantum Appaloosa is a great resource for that. We also run a startup community, One Quantum, and you got the link down here, which is actually not just a startup community, but a community for anyone in quantum tech. We have our Women in Quantum kickoff event in a little over 2 weeks. So this is a community, and you see all the different assets that we offer here, from news feeds to fundraising resources, business resources, who are the journalists, the different companies, and so forth in quantum and so forth. So this is a great spot, One Quantum, where you can get the curated lists of resources and one-on-one help. I myself write a pretty big newsletter, even so I'm 2 weeks late. So you can sign up to that from my website over here. Those are some of the things we look at, and then we just speak with a lot of people. I think this is a growing but still small ecosystem. I know Denise is on the phone all day long, and she doesn't really sleep very much, but we all speak with a lot of people, and I think getting this first-hand information, I can just recommend to any and everyone. Build your own little network, and if you don't know where to start, join us at One Quantum.
So that's good. I would say what's nice about this community right now is it's very small, and we all pretty much know each other, and welcome everybody and welcome your questions. So please feel free to reach out to Andre or to myself, to Terrell, and talk and ask us questions to learn about it. Now, Andre's showing you the One Quantum website. So Andre, I'll let you talk a little bit about the community, but what we're trying to do is establish a community for quantum computing startups, as well as people doing quantum computing, as a way to get more dialogue going and get help from each other, as well as I think there will be some momentum when we can all band together and work with the government or work on different initiatives. So I think a community is a very important thing. Andre, I don't know if you want to add to that, or Terrell?
Well, I have a question for Andre on the data side. So after One Quantum, I do have another question.
Yeah, tell me. And this, we're building out different chapters. We have a chapter for quantum tech startups. You can see that here, and we have over 30 quantum tech startups that joined us already. You see all the different resources we offer them on the right side. We have a Women in Quantum chapter, and that summit on July 28th, 29th, that is starting. Otherwise, get in touch with Denise or myself. The best way to reach me is just Andre Konig. You see my little picture here, and you can send me a message down below, and we'll send you to the right resources. But Terrell, let's get back to the data.
Oh yeah, okay. So I was thinking, in the financial circles, we have a lot of financial ratios, operating ratios, inventory ratios and stuff like that. Do you have you given much thought to uncovering some ratios of interest yet? You've got individual data points, but the power of ratios. Do you plan on getting into that sort of business?
Absolutely, and let me see if we cannot find it in those slides. So what I do with these data points is build relationships, look for extremes, look for gaps, and then try to classify them. And haven't really looked at ratios so far, but a lot of different classifiers as well as scores. So what it allows us to do is build baselines around technology maturity, baselines around business maturity, and baselines around investor maturity. So we have proprietary frameworks with 100 questions each, where we look at specific data points. What kind of technology do they have? How mature is that technology? How is it being deployed? How is it being trialed by customers? What is their roadmap? How present are they in the archives? What is their academic pedigree, and so forth. Same on the business side. Does a company, a startup, a vendor have a business plan, a go-to-market strategy, a channel strategy? What's their marketing like? What is the business pedigree like, and so forth. There are proprietary investment frameworks where we look at things like TAM and SAM, total addressable market, and the total market able to be captured. What is revenue ramp up? We score all these different metrics, and then you see my pretty little hand-drawn quadrant here. We put folks into quadrants where we compare within quantum computing, software, QKDS, communication sensing, and different subsets, how these vendors and startups are performing. So that is absolutely the goal. Not ratios per se, but how can we create, in a very uncertain, sometimes overhyped ecosystem, how can we create some sort of baseline to actually compare people based on some data?
Yeah, I'm particularly interested in the workforce development. So it'd be interesting to somehow, if you had the granularity of data or the fidelity, that we could someday get to the point of saying, for every PhD, let's say, or scientist, there is a support team of 3 people or something to that effect. Because I would imagine, startups, when they create their models, they'll for investors, they'll want to have projections like that based on something, out in the non-technical space, for example, staffing ratios and that sort of thing. I think that'll be particularly valuable as people, start to build companies and such.
It's very interesting data, and
Yeah.
the one data set that we've looked at with respect to what you described is the ratio of business folks versus scientific folks,
Mm-hmm.
and we scored and ranked that. That was roughly 6 months ago, around the new year, and most companies, and by most I mean 95%, fared very, very poorly on that metric. So now the question is that a consequence of the sector, and especially 6 months ago, still being very immature, and folks saying, we need to focus on the science, the technology, and the product? Or is that companies failing to address business realities? Me, again, through my lens of a business person and investor, looking at some of these investment numbers as well, I would expect somebody with business savvy, business education, financial understanding on the team for me to give you capital, for me to believe that you'll be able to deliver a return within the life of my fund, no matter how early or advanced the technology is. So that is a big area of potential improvement for many, in my opinion.
And then a good question, are there any quantum companies that generate significant revenue? Edward, good question.
Revenue, unfortunately, is not public. That is something that you have to pry out of people's, I'll let you finish that thought. And then you have to wonder how honest they are about it. There's one company specifically in quantum key encryption that has historically done very well revenue-wise. The 2-digit $1 million revenue realm. We do have a high representative of probably the largest quantum startup in the world on our call. I don't know, Denise, if you have any comments. What I can tell you is that the vast majority of companies has absolutely no revenue. They have grants, they have research agreements, they do not have revenue in the sense of a paying customer saying, I'm buying your product or your solution. There's consulting revenue, there's research revenue, there is some POC, MVP revenue. All of these are very small. You are starting to see a couple companies, and by couple I literally mean a couple, or maybe twice as many as couple, pulling away from that and starting to build traction. And it's probably not the kind of companies that you would immediately think about. It's not the ones that make the most noise.
So a good question from Sanjay. Are companies today working more on revenue generation or building out IP?
I think they are actually working on both very much at this point. You do have a large fraction of companies claiming that they still want to focus on IP and the basic science. Reality is that today everybody has investors, and if you have an investor, your reality changes as a company and a founder and a CEO. So everybody needs to show some sort of traction, and whether they admit it or not, they have to work on that. The question is how mature and how strategic and how disciplined are they in those approaches? What is my market? Who's my customer? Why would they buy what I offer? What is my revenue model? And there are very, very, very few companies that have that figured out. And by very, very few, again, talking about a handful maybe. But we're starting to see that change. I think, if we have this conversation again at the end of the year, hopefully that will be different.
All right, we have a couple more questions. How about Magic Technologies for revenue?
That's a company. I do not comment on individual companies. Sorry. You can hire me if you want to know about specific companies. But just, in general, revenues is very difficult to verify. It's also not what I would look at. I would look at things, more the strategy, the team, and the resources behind getting revenue rather than an absolute revenue number. I don't think that's a good predictor in the current maturity curve of our industry.
Okay, and then another question is, some companies are claiming to have significantly speeded up many areas, including COVID cure research. How believable is that?
That is great for PR. Something like a vaccine or a medication is absolutely what we believe is, part of the near-term potential use cases. It is not something that anyone has done today or has been able to do. We do not yet have the algorithms, the hardware power to do that. We hope that might be different in 6, 12, 18 months. Today, that is ABS shit, bullshit.
Okay, thank you. Yes, agreed. Any other questions? Will quantum computing have any impact on cryptocurrency and blockchain?
That is the popular question, right? Encryption. Absolutely. Quantum technologies will be able to break encryption. Again, nobody knows the timeline. I think the important thing here is, outside cryptocurrency and blockchain, if you are a bank, a financial service provider, a healthcare provider, you have a fiduciary duty to safeguard your data for certain amounts of time, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, or the government, for example. So all of these companies have to be extremely worried today on how to safeguard their data for when a quantum computer will be able to break it, because you don't want your archives and retrospectival data to be vulnerable. blockchain and cryptocurrencies, there are new protocols coming out, quantum resistant keys, and the National Institute of Science and Standards, Technology and Standards in Colorado is spearheading those efforts. They'll be fine. If you have Bitcoin lying around, probably put it in a cold storage.
Okay, and one more question. Have you included any patenting information in your modeling?
Great question. No, but hopefully next time we speak, we're working on that.
Good.
You and Anthony should get together on that. Anthony, you'll be giving a talk about patents. I don't know when it is, soon.
Yeah, it's a very interesting source of data. I just haven't had the bandwidth to deal with it yet. We're looking at doing that.
Okay. Cool. Any other questions?
All right. Again, you have our contact details on the website, Quantum World Detangled QIS/QIS ecosystem. You can get in touch with me and Denise there. Check out onequantum.org. Any questions about the data or any specific feedback, opinions, reach out. Always happy to discuss.
Great. Thank you.
All right. Have a good night, everybody.
All right. Thank you.
Everyone.
I just put a link in the chat for Anthony's talk coming up for everybody here, and Andre and Denise. You should probably pay a visit that day. It'll be full of data, I believe. Okay. Thank you both very much, Denise, Andre. I appreciate it. It was a fairly quiet group today. We often use the microphones, but everybody, I guess, was microphone shy today. But it turned out really well. Thank you very much, everybody else, for coming. Cynthia, Edward, good to see you. Jamie, and so on. John, Sanjay, there you go. David, Catalina, did I get everybody? Yefim? Have a good night, everybody. We'll see you next time.
Appreciate all your questions.
Thanks very much.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
See ya.